All right, guys, welcome to part 9, where we're going to look at some mixing tips and tricks for snares. Before we start talking about the snare mixing, I have to go back to the kick, because in EDM, the kick and the snare, they kind of have this synergistic relationship, right? It's you can't have one without the other type thing for the most part, so they have to play off of each other nicely. So let's talk about gain staging real quick. But gain staging is essentially how loud you set your volumes of what instrument to basically equate to the overall sound dynamics or volume of your track. So with that being said, well, what should the kick and snare equate to in your mix? Well, in EDM, the kick's going to be one of the loudest tracks in the whole song or production. In genres like main room, dubstep, even progressive, even certain feels of house, like deep house and things like that, future house, the kick becomes one of the loudest instruments. It's probably as loud as the main lead. And a good rule of thumb is to have your kick, if we solo this, have it peak on your master around, and make sure you're looking at the master if you have any processing on it. If you don't have processing on your master, it doesn't really matter. I have the sausage fattener on right now just so I don't clip a whole lot during this process, because I playing samples and dragging and dropping. I don't want to kill your guys' ears. So let's just say hypothetically that this kick is at -0.5. I want it peaking at about -0.1. That's a good rule of thumb to have. So if we turn off the sausage fattener and listen to this. All right, -0.9, I'm almost there. All right, -1.1, I think it was, or almost. Let's try it again. All right, so -1.5, that'd give me a little bit of headroom. So if you start there, start with the kick, so -1.2, that'll work. That gives you some headroom, and it also allows you to now know how loud that snare needs to be. So start with the kick. I know this sounds kind of backwards because we're talking about mixing a snare, and I've just spent 5 minutes mixing and gain staging my kick. But once you gain stage your kick, the snare becomes a lot easier. So right now, for a genre like tropical house, the snare was a little loud. So let's talk about that real quick. Every genre has its own volume level of how loud the snare is going to be, right? So with dubstep and trap, snares are quite loud. With maybe progressive or tropical house, the snares or claps actually more often in the drops. It's usually a clap, not a snare, but usually they're not that loud. It's the kick is a little bit over that. Now, in a lot of genres of EDM, they're even. Now, the reason I'm saying all this is not to be like, here's steadfast rules you must live by. Once you kind of know the guidelines, it becomes easier to create your own feel and sound, just being like, okay, I'm doing a progressive track. Here's how it typically is. Let me try bending this rule a little bit to make it my own. And that's the reason why you got to learn these rules, is to actually be able to break them to make your own sound. So right now, my mix is a little bit louder than the kick because I just took everything down. So let's turn my mix down now. All right, so right now the kick is a big part of the mix. Let's compare it with the lead. So that's peaking at like -14. So that's good. That means my mix is going to be, this is a mix that's typical for EDM. It's going to be a little bit more geared towards the kick being louder. Now, with tropical house, by no means does the kick have to be the loudest part. It's usually kind of the same volume or just tucked under it's usually tucked under your lead actually a little. So that's the first step of mixing your snare, is gain staging your kick. And that's why I said it's so helpful to start with the melodic content. Because if I didn't have this melodic content, I wouldn't know, how my snare is reacting to the sound. So start with your chords, go back to that idea, and once you get your kick, it's really easy to start mixing your snare. All right, let's find ways to get this to pop out from the mix and actually talk about the snare for the first time in this video. So what can we do to this? Well, we can, of course, do things like compression and even an enveloper or enveloper. But what about some other ways to kind of separate this in the mix? So right now, if I pull up my multimeter, this has some good stereo content going on. You can leave your snares in stereo. So the kick is in mono. I do have the sub bass going on. Definitely want that to be mono. So I used a stock bass in Nexus. I don't think Nexus has a mono version. So again, I'm gonna bounce this to audio. Call this sub. Right. I will change this to mono. And I need to change my EQ to mono. And now this is a monophonic sound. All right, cool. So that is the first thing you'll look at when you're mixing that snare, is how to clean up certain elements that can maybe be mono, right? Because when I change this from mono to stereo, yeah, the frequencies aren't going to be crossing over a whole lot, because one's a sub frequency and snares don't have a lot of sub frequencies, if any at all. But what we're doing is just cleaning up unwanted sound and noise from the stereo field. So the snare now has just a pinch more room to breathe. So I'll look at cleaning up the mix, maybe monophonically or whatever. And then what you can do is, when you have a little progression going like this, do you see how these chords are panned to about -14 and +13? So just like a little bit. I can even go just 10 and 10, right? So now these are panned left and right, -10, +10. So it's still, to our ears, sounds like they're, the same sound source, almost centered. But with the snare remaining centered, it gives just a little bit of separation for the snare to shine through. And the reason why you're doing these things, what might seem like subtle tweaks, when you do 3, maybe 5 subtle tweaks, they add up into a big change. And it's so much easier to mix your tracks doing these types of things than trying to just adjust volume and compression and dynamics, because getting it to fit with our gain staged kick becomes easier once we know, okay, this is where the snare needs to be, because this is where my kick has to be. And the kick is a very, very important element to this song or this genre of EDM. So let's, fit everything around the most important element, is that type of idea. So now that we got things cleaned up in the center, we got our monophonic stereo choices taken care of, let's actually start to process this snare. So it sounds all right with zero processing. Think about that. It's just a sample, right? There's nothing going on. So first thing I'll do, I can load up an EQ. I'll just load up Logic's EQ here. Turn on an analyzer, and let's just see what we got going on. All right, so there are some sub frequencies going on in this. Not sub, but low frequency. So I might cut out a little bit of lows here. All right, now weirdly enough with this snare, a lot's going on at 200. So I might take 200 down. Now what we're doing is we're creating separation by EQ. So you could pan things to create separation, which does left and right separating. Or you could do reverb and delay. That does 3-dimensional forwards and backwards in your mix. Or you can do EQ, which is kind of like choosing your paint palette to make certain colors pop in a painting or not. So the reason why I'm cutting 200 is if we open up our kick here, and let me throw on a EQ on my kick. Let's see what's going on with this kick. All right, so see, lots happening right at 200, right? From like 50 to 200, that's the bulk of the kick. So if I didn't want to actually do that, I was just showing you and highlighting it. So we'll recall the default. So yeah, there's a lot going on at 200. So I don't want a whole lot going on at 200. So I'll make a narrow Q edit here, or fairly narrow, and just cut it just a little bit, just to let a little bit more of the frequencies of the kick shine through, and actually allow some of the frequencies of the snare to shine above it. So let's look at this. All right, so now let's look at the other element of the mix that a snare is going to compete with, and that's going to be the lead. So let's look at what we have going on with this lead sound. All right, so the majority of this lead's happening at 500 and 2K. So there's not a lot of sub-frequency going on with this. I could actually probably clean this sound up a little. All right, so see that little space in between 500 and 2K? I don't want to do anything at 200. I have two options here. 200's off limits because of the kick and actually my bass too. I haven't even checked that out yet. But I could maybe edit from like 300, 400 to 500 to make the snare pop. But typically you want this to be more of a high frequency content. So if we look at our lead, I'm now going to cut just a pinch of my 500 range, right? Because that's that same idea. The leads really happen at 500 and 2K. And what I'm going to do now is we're going to boost at, do you see this little space from about 1K to 2K? This is my lead right here. See this space? So from 750 hertz here, we can try this into about 750. There's some space to play. All right, so I'll go actually to 1,000. And we have... So from about 750 to 1,300, we have some space to really, make a boost. So I'll go to about 1,220. And then what I'll do is I will boost this just a little. So we're going to do a narrow Q edit here. So let's solo the snare in isolation. All right, we'll turn the EQ off now. Again, subtle changes, but we're just trying to do some things to separate from the mix. Now, finally, I'm going to go to the very high part of my frequency and just add a little bit from like 10K up to 20K. That will add some high frequency content and allow it to pop out over all the other sounds because there's nothing really that high in my mix right now. All right, so there you have it. There is the first thing I'll always do is I'll EQ it around my other instruments. And I won't look at it like every instrument, right? I'm just comparing this to the most important elements that the snare is going to struggle with. Like you notice I didn't even care to look at the frequencies of these chords here, and that's just because, let me take the bass out of these, just because I'm anal, but that's because I pan those off, center a little bit, and they're not the main element that's competing with the snare. The main element's going to be your lead, your bass, your sub bass, and your kick, just because those are all centered. So I actually really like this right now. I could see myself doing very little other processing if I was to turn this into a full track. I can show you what other things I would potentially do, and all this applies for any snare, for any genre of EDM. Those EQ edits I did, compare it to your kick, compare it to your bass, compare it to your lead, and make sure things aren't struggling to coexist, and then just make slight edits. I mean, I may not even need to do this middle one here. I could just boost these two little frequencies here. Notice that there's small boosts when I do boost. Most of it is cutting. It's taking away frequencies instead of adding frequencies. Okay, so let's fill out now. We could do, obviously, we talked about this with the kick and enveloper, right? We could do that. I actually kind of like that for this sound. So if we turn the gain down of the body, or the release, right, now we actually have like an 808 snare. That's kind of fun. So see, I think snares are really fun to work with. I actually really like that. All right, so we literally just changed the sample sound. So let's solo this. On, off. And that's all through an enveloper. So yeah, there's a lot of things you can do here. That's now a mixed thing. Now that I think this works with this genre. Because I have some more attack coming through, just a little bit. I might turn that down a pinch. And I have more of the sound of the release happening, which I think is kind of cool. All right, so there's the second thing you can do is throw on an enveloper before you get to the compression. Now with this sound, I don't think it needs to be compressed. It sounds pretty good. The sample's probably already compressed anyway. So same thing. You could throw on some pre-fader, parallel New York style compression here. If you really wanted to try thickening it up, I'll show you what that process could look like. We'll do pre-fader, and I'll turn this up to maybe just 13, negative 13. And we'll do the same thing. We'll use the 1176. So that made it 10 times louder. Let's see if there's a cool snare preset we can start with. Let's try this, see what happens. I mean, I actually kind of like that. It's thickening it up. I might, let's turn that off, the noise off on that. But let's go to the enveloper now. I'm just turning down that gain because this is the sound's being compressed before it hits the EQ or the enveloper or the enveloper. Before all that happens, so I needed to go in and change that. But I actually like how that compression's happening. It's kind of adding a little bit of thickness to it. Cool thing is I can control the amount of send and turn the actual, effect down if I need to. So I'm going to turn off all the effects as it's playing. Hear that difference? It's quite noticeable what we've done so far. It's just minor edits. So we first step to recap what we did. We made sure the mix didn't have too many things in stereo that were centered. We made the kick mono. We made the sub bass mono. We looked at the bass if it could be mono, but sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. That's totally up to you depending on your genre. And then what we did was we did an EQ and we carved up the EQ doing mostly subtractive, reductive cuts on the frequencies that, shared instruments in the centered mix. You don't need to care about things that are pan left out on left and right. And then what we did was we stuck an enveloper on just to see what happened, and it worked. And then I added some parallel compression to thicken things up, and we have a really good snare sound. All right, another cool thing you can do is with another bus here, we will throw on some kind of gated reverb. So I will use the audio units here. We'll use Vverb by Vengeance just because they have a tempo synced delay here. I do not want to update you at the moment. So yeah, there's a sync here and I can do pre-delay. So what we'll do now is let's try to turn the mix up all the way and solo this. So what you just heard was just the reverbed signal, and it's happening a eighth note after my actual snare hits. So let's listen to it all together. Then I'll turn that effect down, turn the mix down, and then I'll mess with, the decay and the size of everything. So let's solo that. So that's what it sounds like. It's making this thing uber thick. Let's listen to it in context now. So we just covered, and that would probably be the last thing I do. You can always do some things like saturation, add some maybe like high frequency distortion if you need to, but that's typically going to be more for genres like dubstep and things that you really need to gritty up the snare. Now everything I just showed you is going to work for every genre of EDM snare. This is just sound mixing practices as much as it is in the EDM world or pop world, whatever it is. So this snare now, what we did when we're looking in context of mixing steps, what we did with this was we did the EQ, we added some attack, we added some gain to the parts of the kick or the snare that we liked, and then we did some parallel compression to thicken it up. And we moved elements in the mix around to fit the snare, so we basically did our panning. And then what we did was we added that third dimension of sound, which is going to be reverb. It's going to add some depth to your mix. And so all things considered, this is a pretty cool sounding snare. So let's just play the kick and snare. There you go. So we have a cool snare. And if you follow that process for any snare, you're going to get a pretty darn good sound, especially if you're starting with a good sample. So I'll see you in the next video.